What if we told you that in many 19th century orphanages, the majority of children were not orphans at all? What if the word orphan was not a description of loss, but a label of convenience? In the dimly lit corridors of brick orphan asylums that rose across America and Britain in the late 1800s, thousands of children slept in orderly rows of iron beds. Their hair was cropped short, their names recorded in careful ledgers, their identities reduced to a single word: orphan. The public believed these institutions were sanctuaries for children whose parents had perished from war, epidemic disease, or sudden tragedy. It is a comforting narrative, one of charity, benevolence, and moral duty embedded in orphanage history and the early child welfare system. But when we examine that history more closely, when we turn the brittle pages of admission books, census records, and reform reports, a far more unsettling picture begins to emerge. By the early 20th century, social investigators were already documenting something extraordinary. In city after city, reports revealed that a striking percentage of institutionalized children had at least one living parent. In some regions, observers estimated that nearly 70% were not true orphans. In certain institutions, that figure climbed toward 90%. These were not children entirely alone in the world. They had mothers, sometimes fathers, sometimes grandparents, still living within a few miles of the very buildings that now confined them. So why were they there? The rise of the orphanage system is usually framed within the upheaval of the Industrial Revolution: urban overcrowding, waves of immigration, cholera outbreaks sweeping through tenements, factory accidents leaving families shattered. We are told that orphan asylums expanded as a humanitarian response to mass parental death. And yes, disease and hardship did claim countless lives. But the numbers resist this explanation when examined carefully. Because if most children in orphanages had living parents, then we are forced to confront a deeper mystery within the hidden history of adoption and institutional care. Were these places truly designed for parentless children, or did the definition of orphan itself quietly shift under social pressure? The term begins to blur as soon as we inspect the language of institutional records. Many children were categorized as half-orphans, a child with one deceased parent and one living parent. Even that classification complicates the popular image. But the complexity deepens further. Numerous children listed simply as orphan had no parental death recorded at all. Instead, their admission reasons often read: poverty, illness of mother, unemployment of father, temporary hardship, moral danger, destitution. Poverty was not death. Yet poverty seemed to function as a kind of social death sentence for family unity. As industrial cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and London expanded in the mid-19th century, reform movements grew increasingly concerned about what they described as dangerous classes. Children wandering unsupervised streets were perceived not only as vulnerable, but as potential future criminals. Institutionalization became framed as rescue, but it also functioned as containment. Here the anomaly sharpens. If the majority of these children were not parentless, then orphanages were not merely houses of refuge. They were mechanisms of separation, systems that redefined children of the poor as effectively parentless, even when they were not. Who benefited from this redefinition? The physical scale of orphanages suggests that something larger was unfolding. Massive red brick complexes funded by religious organizations and philanthropic elites dominated urban skylines. Dormitories built to house hundreds at a time. Industrial kitchens capable of feeding entire populations. Workshops and farms where older children labored daily. These were not modest shelters for emergency relief. They were institutional systems designed for volume. And scale implies structure. Structure implies intention. When we trace the development of the child welfare system alongside broader economic forces, a pattern begins to form. Rapid industrialization created wealth, but also extreme inequality. Widowed mothers often had few employment options beyond domestic service, which made raising multiple children nearly impossible. Economic downturns left fathers unemployed overnight. Immigrant families unfamiliar with English law were especially vulnerable to intervention by charitable societies. In many documented cases, parents signed placement agreements believing the arrangement would be temporary. They were promised education for their children, moral instruction, perhaps even improved health. Some expected reunification once financial stability returned. Yet countless institutional records show that reunions rarely occurred. Siblings were separated. Names were changed. Identities quietly reshaped. The word orphan smoothed over these complexities. It erased nuance. It removed the uncomfortable reality that many of these children were not abandoned, not bereaved, but poor. The more we examine census data from the late 1800s and early 1900s, the more difficult it becomes to sustain the simplified narrative. Mortality rates alone cannot explain the sheer volume of institutionalized children. If epidemics were solely responsible, we would expect far higher adult death rates corresponding precisely to orphanage admissions. Instead, we find something subtler: children entering institutions during economic panics, labor strikes, housing shortages, and seasonal unemployment. This raises a quiet but profound question. Was the orphanage system primarily a response to death or to poverty? And if poverty was the true underlying factor, then the label orphan begins to look less like a factual description and more like a bureaucratic tool, a classification that allowed authorities to intervene without directly accusing parents of failure, a linguistic mechanism that transformed economic hardship into moral necessity. As we stand within this opening layer of the investigation, the image of the orphanage changes. The iron beds remain. The orderly ledgers remain. But the story shifts from simple tragedy to something more structural, something embedded in industrial growth, moral reform, and social control. If up to 90% of children had living parents, then orphanage history is not only about compassion. It is about how societies define worth, how they decide which families are fit, how language itself can redraw the boundaries of belonging. The word orphan may have hidden more than it revealed, and once that possibility enters our thinking, the comfortable narrative begins to fracture, revealing a deeper system beneath it, one that demands closer examination. To understand how such a redefinition could take root, we must step into the world that gave birth to the modern orphanage system. The mid-19th century was an age of upheaval. Between the 1830s and the early 1900s, industrial cities in the United States and Britain swelled at a pace never before witnessed. Factories multiplied. Railroads stretched across continents. Immigrant ships arrived daily, unloading families into neighborhoods already straining under overcrowding and disease. Official history tells us that orphan asylums expanded in response to visible suffering. Cholera epidemics in the 1840s and 1850s. Tuberculosis sweeping through tenement districts. The American Civil War in the 1860s, leaving widows and fatherless children in its wake. In Britain, industrial accidents and harsh labor conditions created similar tragedies. The narrative appears straightforward. Parents died, children required care, and yet the timeline complicates the simplicity. By 1854, when Charles Loring Brace founded what would become the Orphan Train movement in New York City, orphanages were already housing thousands of children whose parents were very much alive. Brace himself wrote extensively about children of the dangerous classes, describing them not primarily as bereaved, but as neglected, impoverished, and morally endangered. His solution was not merely shelter, it was relocation. Between 1854 and the early 1920s, an estimated 200,000 children were transported from urban centers to rural homes across America. They were called orphans, but many were not. Brace argued that removing children from slums would save them from crime and vice. He framed the effort as moral rescue. Yet contemporary admission records show that numerous children placed on trains had one or both parents living. Some were surrendered temporarily during periods of unemployment. Others were taken after authorities judged their home environments unsuitable, not because of abuse, but because of poverty. The language of reform reveals something telling. Reports from the late 19th century frequently distinguish between destitute children and true orphans. The distinction mattered internally, but to the public, all became simply orphans. The simplification smoothed the moral terrain. It is easier to rally support for children without parents than for families struggling within systemic inequality. By the 1870s and 1880s, orphan asylums had become permanent fixtures of urban life. Catholic, Protestant, and secular institutions alike constructed vast facilities capable of housing hundreds at a time. Annual reports proudly listed capacity numbers, expansions, and donor contributions. The scale of these institutions far exceeded what temporary epidemic surges alone would require. If mass parental death were the primary driver, we would expect admissions to spike sharply during epidemics and recede afterward. Instead, institutional populations remained consistently high across decades, even during periods when adult mortality rates stabilized. This persistence suggests another engine beneath the surface. Industrial capitalism created volatile cycles. Economic panics in 1873 and 1893 plunged thousands of families into sudden unemployment. Seasonal labor meant irregular income. A factory injury could remove a father's wages overnight. For widowed or deserted mothers, options were brutally limited. Social welfare systems were minimal. Workhouses were stigmatized. Charity came with conditions. In this environment, orphanages functioned as a form of social insurance, though rarely described as such. Parents unable to feed their children sometimes approached institutions voluntarily, believing the placement temporary. Yet once admitted, children entered bureaucratic systems that often made return difficult. Some institutions required proof of financial stability before reunification. Others prioritized adoption placements over family restoration. Thus, the orphanage became both refuge and gatekeeper. The official rhetorics insisted that institutional life offered structure, discipline, and moral training. Reports emphasized education, religious instruction, and vocational preparation. Donors were reassured that children were being molded into productive citizens. But beneath these assurances lay a subtle shift. Poverty itself was treated as evidence of parental inadequacy. A living parent without resources could be deemed insufficient. Census records from the late 19th century quietly reinforce this reality. In multiple urban surveys, investigators discovered that a significant proportion of children in orphanages had at least one surviving parent living within the same city. Reformers, such as Homer Folks in the early 1900s, criticized the overuse of institutionalization, arguing that many children would be better served by supporting families directly rather than separating them. Their critiques reveal that the issue was widely recognized, even then. So why did the system persist? Part of the answer lies in institutional momentum. Once built, orphanages required occupants. They depended on funding tied to numbers served. Religious organizations viewed child saving as both spiritual mission and social duty. Placing children in controlled environments allowed reformers to shape behavior, language, and values, especially among immigrant populations viewed with suspicion. Here the narrative grows more complex. Orphanages were not inherently malicious. Many caregivers believed sincerely in their mission. Some children did find safety and opportunity. The system cannot be reduced to cruelty alone, but intention does not erase structure. When we examine the numbers, the pattern repeats. High percentages of children with living parents, admissions linked to poverty rather than death, institutional growth continuing independent of epidemic waves. The word orphan stretched to encompass circumstances far beyond its literal meaning. It became elastic. And elasticity in language often signals deeper transformation. When a term expands beyond its original definition, it usually serves a new function. In this case, that function appears tied to social management. Labeling a child an orphan removed the uncomfortable need to confront economic injustice. It shifted responsibility from systemic forces to individual families. A child of poverty could be reframed as a child of tragedy. This reframing altered public perception. Donors gave more generously. Policymakers intervened more confidently. The moral clarity of rescue overshadowed the moral ambiguity of separation. As industrial societies matured, the orphanage system became embedded in civic identity. Buildings stood as monuments to benevolence. Annual charity balls celebrated their existence. Photographs of uniformed children lined up in neat rows reassured communities that order prevailed over chaos. Yet beneath the symmetry of those images lay a quieter truth. Many of those children had mothers waiting, fathers searching for work, families fractured not by death, but by economic fragility. The distinction may seem subtle, but its implications are enormous. Because if the majority were not truly orphaned, then orphanages were not simply emergency shelters responding to catastrophe. They were institutional responses to poverty itself. And poverty, unlike death, is not inevitable. It is shaped by policy, labor markets, housing conditions, and social priorities. As we continue to trace this history, the pattern begins to solidify. The expansion of orphan asylums aligns less with mortality statistics and more with industrial volatility, less with war casualties and more with urban reform campaigns. The official explanation remains part of the story, but not its entirety. The word orphan did not merely describe reality, it reshaped it. And once we recognize that shift, we begin to see the orphanage not only as a building of refuge, but as a mirror reflecting how society defined family responsibility and worth in an age of rapid transformation. Once we accept that the term orphan may have stretched beyond its literal meaning, the anomalies begin to multiply. What first appeared as an uncomfortable statistic, 70 to 90% with living parents, unfolds into a series of contradictions that are difficult to ignore. The first anomaly emerges directly from institutional admission records, when historians and social reformers began examining orphanage ledgers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They found that parental death was often not the primary reason for entry. Instead, the most common notations read, "Father ill, mother unable to provide, parents destitute, temporary surrender, or simply poverty." In some cities, official surveys revealed that fewer than 1/3 of institutionalized children had lost both parents. The majority were what administrators sometimes called dependent children. Dependent, not orphaned. Why, then, were they publicly described under a term that implied total parental loss? If accuracy were the goal, why not distinguish clearly between bereavement and economic hardship? The persistence of the label suggests that something more than precision was at work. The second anomaly lies in geography. Census comparisons from urban districts show that in many cases, living parents resided within walking distance of the institutions housing their children. Reform reports from cities like New York and Philadelphia noted that some mothers visited when permitted, bringing small gifts or letters. The children were not invisible to their families. They were physically separated by policy, not by mortality. If these parents were alive and present, why was institutionalization favored over direct family support? A third anomaly appears in the structure of funding. Many orphanages received financial support based on the number of children housed. Public subsidies, church donations, and philanthropic contributions were often calculated per capita. More children meant more resources. While this does not prove malicious intent, it introduces a subtle incentive. Institutional growth required occupancy, and occupancy required classification. If a struggling family could be redefined as producing an orphan, then the pathway to institutional admission became smoother. The label simplified eligibility. It converted economic complexity into a single, emotionally compelling category. The fourth anomaly concerns duration. Many parents were told that placement would be temporary, an arrangement lasting only until financial stability returned. Yet records reveal that children often remained institutionalized for years. Reunification procedures were inconsistent and sometimes obstructed by administrative barriers. In certain cases, once a child entered the system, the bureaucratic momentum favored permanence. Temporary hardship became permanent separation. Why would a system ostensibly designed for emergency care fail to prioritize restoration of families once crises passed? A fifth anomaly emerges when we examine sibling separation. Numerous orphanage archives document brothers and sisters admitted together but later distributed to different foster placements or adoptive homes. The justification was often practical, matching children to available families, but the effect was fragmentation. If the original goal were simply to preserve child welfare during parental death, keeping siblings together would seem a natural priority. Instead, dispersal frequently prevailed. What does this suggest about the deeper function of the system? Then there is the anomaly of labor. Older children in orphanages were routinely assigned to workshops, farms, laundries, and kitchens. Institutional reports framed this as vocational training, preparing youth for productive adulthood. Yet the labor also sustained the institutions themselves. In rural placements associated with movements like the Orphan Trains, children provided much-needed agricultural labor for farming families. Were these children rescued or redistributed? Contemporary critics raised similar questions. By the early 1900s, reformers such as Homer Folks and other child welfare advocates began arguing that institutional care was overused. They pointed out that supporting families directly, through modest financial assistance, would often cost less than maintaining large orphanages. Their findings suggested that many separations were economically unnecessary. If family preservation was cheaper and emotionally healthier, why did large-scale institutionalization continue? Another anomaly surfaces in language itself. Annual orphanage reports frequently highlighted the moral improvement of children removed from corrupting influences. Poverty was subtly conflated with moral deficiency. Immigrant neighborhoods were described as breeding grounds of vice. Institutionalization was presented not only as charity, but as purification. When poverty becomes moralized, removal can be justified as reform. Yet this raises a fundamental contradiction. If children were primarily victims of parental death, why was there so much emphasis on rescuing them from the character of their families? The rhetoric aligns more closely with social engineering than with emergency relief. We also encounter statistical inconsistencies. During certain decades when adult mortality declined due to public health improvements, orphanage populations did not proportionally decrease. If death rates were falling, why did institutional populations remain stable or even grow? The data suggests that admissions were influenced less by mortality trends and more by economic cycles and social policy. The pattern begins to resemble a tapestry whose threads, once examined individually, reveal tension beneath the surface. First thread: the majority had living parents. Second thread: poverty was the leading cause of admission. Third thread: funding structures incentivized high occupancy. Fourth thread: reunification was rare despite promises. Fifth thread: language framed removal as moral uplift. Individually, each thread might be explained away. Together, they form a pattern that challenges the simplicity of the official narrative. We must ask ourselves a difficult question. Was the orphanage system primarily about caring for children without parents or about managing children of the poor? If the latter, then the label orphan functioned as a kind of social shorthand. It bypassed debates about labor rights, wages, housing reform, and immigrant integration. It transformed systemic inequality into individual tragedy. And tragedy is easier to respond to than injustice. Consider how public sympathy operates. A child whose parents have died evokes immediate compassion. A child whose parents are unemployed evokes more complicated emotions, questions about responsibility, morality, and effort. By collapsing these categories into one, institutions simplified the moral equation. The orphan became a universal symbol of innocence untethered from social context. But symbols can obscure reality. As we gather these anomalies, like scattered documents across a desk, the image shifts from accidental misclassification to structural redefinition. It becomes increasingly difficult to believe that the term's elasticity was incidental. Instead, it appears functional. The orphanage ledger may have recorded names and ages with precision, but the category itself concealed nuance. A living mother struggling in a tenement apartment could be erased by a single word in ink: orphan. The evidence does not suggest conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It suggests something more subtle and perhaps more powerful: a gradual normalization of separation under the banner of benevolence. And when separation becomes normalized, it reshapes society's understanding of family itself. The anomalies are no longer isolated curiosities. They begin to converge, pointing toward a system in which language, economics, and morality intertwine to redefine childhood under industrial modernity. The question is no longer whether most institutionalized children had living parents. The question is why that reality was absorbed so quietly into a narrative that told a very different story. When we place these anomalies side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. Not abrupt, not dramatic, but steady and structural. It is as though we are assembling fragments of an old map. Each piece alone appears ordinary, but once aligned, the contours reveal a landscape very different from the one we were taught to see. The first connection becomes visible when we compare orphanage expansion with economic volatility rather than mortality. The financial panics of 1873 and 1893 triggered waves of unemployment across industrial America and Britain. Factories closed, railroads collapsed, wages evaporated. In the wake of these economic contractions, orphanage admissions rose, not because epidemics had surged, but because families had lost income. If parental death were the principal cause of institutionalization, we would expect admissions to correlate primarily with wars or disease outbreaks. Instead, the data suggests alignment with job loss, housing crises, and industrial instability. The deeper we dig, the clearer this becomes. Orphanages functioned as shock absorbers for economic systems that provided little safety net. And yet society did not describe them that way. The map grows clearer when we examine funding mechanisms. In many jurisdictions, orphanages received per-child subsidies from municipal or state authorities. Religious charities supplemented these funds through donations tied to visible outcomes: numbers housed, numbers educated, numbers placed into homes. A system built on per capita financing naturally expanded toward capacity. Empty beds represented inefficiency. Full dormitories represented success. It is not necessary to assume cruelty to recognize the structural pressure embedded within such a model. Institutions grow toward the incentives that sustain them. When funding flows in proportion to occupancy, occupancy becomes a priority. Now consider the cultural dimension unfolding simultaneously. The late 19th century was marked by intense anxieties about immigration, urban disorder, and class instability. Reformers often described slum neighborhoods as breeding grounds for crime and degeneracy. Children raised in such environments were perceived not merely as vulnerable, but as potential threats to social order. Here, the orphanage intersects with moral reform. If a child of poverty could be removed from what reformers deemed a corrupting environment and placed into a disciplined institutional setting, the act could be framed as both rescue and prevention. Prevention of crime, prevention of moral decay, prevention of social unrest. Under this logic, the presence of living parents became secondary to the perceived quality of those parents' circumstances. Poverty itself became evidence of inadequacy. And so the map expands again. Economic instability increases family vulnerability. Funding structures reward institutional growth. Cultural fears about disorder justify intervention. Together, these forces create a system in which the category of orphan stretches to accommodate children who do not fit its literal definition. The pattern deepens when we examine demographic statistics. In cities where mortality rates were documented with precision, the number of children institutionalized often exceeded what parental death alone could explain. If, for example, adult mortality in a given district suggested a certain number of bereaved children, yet institutional populations doubled or tripled that estimate, the discrepancy demands explanation. Where did the additional children come from? The answer repeatedly is poverty. Reform commissions in the early 20th century began calculating the cost difference between maintaining a child in an orphanage and providing modest financial support to a struggling parent. In many cases, direct aid would have been significantly cheaper. This realization fueled the early development of mothers' pensions and family preservation initiatives. But such reforms came slowly. Why did it take decades for policymakers to question a system whose economic logic was already visible? The answer may lie in the moral clarity offered by the orphan narrative. Charity toward the parentless requires no structural critique. Charity toward the poor, by contrast, invites questions about wages, labor conditions, housing laws, and inequality. Supporting families directly would have required confronting industrial capitalism's fragility. Supporting orphanages required only generosity. The map now reveals a larger terrain: orphanages as part of a broader architecture of social management during industrialization. Alongside workhouses, reform schools, and asylums, they formed a network of institutions designed to stabilize society amid rapid change. Stability often comes at a cost, and that cost, in this case, appears to have been family cohesion. Let us consider the metaphor of the puzzle once more. At first, the pieces seem scattered anomalies: living parents, economic admissions, funding incentives, moral rhetoric. Now they interlock. The image emerging is not of isolated acts of charity, nor of overt conspiracy, but of a system shaped by incentives and fears. A system that redefined vulnerability. Children of poverty were recast as children of loss. Parents facing temporary hardship were reframed as absent. Language performed the transformation quietly. Once the label was applied, the public imagination followed, and language, once institutionalized, becomes self-reinforcing. The term orphan asylum adorned buildings and letterheads. Newspapers repeated it. Donors embraced it. Generations grew up assuming its literal truth. Over time, the elasticity of the word hardened into accepted reality. Meanwhile, inside those red brick walls, children navigated a life structured by bells and schedules. Some found education and opportunity. Others experienced loneliness and displacement. Many carried the invisible knowledge that somewhere beyond the gates, a living parent remained. The map's final contour appears when we compare this era to later reforms. By the early 20th century, progressive child welfare advocates increasingly argued that children belonged with families whenever possible. The 1909 White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children declared that home life was the highest and finest product of civilization. Institutionalization, it suggested, should be a last resort. Such a declaration would have been unnecessary if orphanages were truly filled only with parentless children. The very need for reform implies recognition of overreach. Thus, the connections converge. Economic volatility, institutional incentives, moral anxieties, linguistic simplification, delayed reform. Each element reinforces the others. Together, they illuminate a system less about responding to mass bereavement and more about regulating poverty. We are no longer examining isolated anomalies. We are tracing a pattern that runs through decades of policy and perception. And as this pattern sharpens, a new question presses forward, not about what happened, but about why it was framed the way it was. Why was society so willing to accept the fiction of universal orphanhood? The answer may lie in what that fiction made possible. When all these threads are pulled tight, economic instability, funding incentives, moral reform movements, statistical inconsistencies. The pattern resolves into a conclusion that is both simple and unsettling. The word orphan was not merely descriptive, it was functional. All these clues point toward one central hypothesis. During the height of industrialization, the term orphan evolved into a bureaucratic and moral category designed to justify the large-scale removal of children from poor families. It allowed society to intervene without directly confronting the structural roots of poverty. It transformed economic hardship into a narrative of rescue. In short, many children were not orphaned by death. They were orphaned by definition. This is the turning point in our investigation. Because once we accept that language can redefine reality, everything else begins to align. The anomalies no longer appear contradictory. They become logical consequences of a system built on classification. Consider the problem faced by 19th century reformers. Industrial cities were swelling with immigrant labor. Slums expanded faster than sanitation systems. Wages fluctuated violently. Children roamed streets selling newspapers, shining shoes, scavenging for survival. The spectacle of child poverty was visible and politically uncomfortable. But addressing wages, labor laws, housing standards, and social welfare required systemic change. It required challenging powerful economic interests. That path was complex and slow. Redefining vulnerable children as orphans was immediate and morally unambiguous. If a child was an orphan, society had a clear obligation: remove, shelter, discipline, educate. The narrative required no confrontation with factory owners or landlords. It demanded only compassion, and compassion, when channeled through institutions, could be organized. This hypothesis explains the elasticity of the term. A child with a deceased father and living mother could be labeled an orphan. A child whose father abandoned the family could be labeled an orphan. A child whose parents were temporarily unemployed could, under institutional logic, also be labeled an orphan, because their home environment was deemed insufficient. The definition quietly shifted from parentless to without proper provision. Provision, however, is economic, and economics are social. Once the shift occurred, the rest followed naturally. Funding structures rewarded occupancy because society believed it was saving abandoned children. Moral reform rhetoric emphasized uplift because it framed poverty as corruption. Institutional permanence became normalized because the children inside were presumed to have no viable alternative. The puzzle piece clicks into place. Orphanages were not primarily constructed to respond to catastrophic parental mortality. They were constructed to manage the children of families destabilized by industrial capitalism. This does not mean every case was unjust. Genuine orphans existed. Epidemics and wars did leave children truly bereaved. Nor does it mean every reformer acted cynically. Many believed sincerely that institutional life offered safety and opportunity. But systems operate beyond individual intentions. And when a system consistently absorbs children whose parents are alive, we must ask what function it serves beyond emergency care. The hypothesis gains further strength when we examine the timing of reform movements. By the early 20th century, as progressive social policies began addressing labor conditions and child welfare more directly, institutionalization rates gradually declined. Mothers' pensions, introduced in various states after 1911, provided small stipends to widowed or impoverished mothers so they could keep children at home. The logic was straightforward. It was better, and often cheaper, to support families than to dismantle them. If financial support could prevent institutionalization, then many previous admissions were not inevitable tragedies. They were preventable outcomes of policy choices. This realization reframes the entire era. The orphanage becomes less a sanctuary of last resort and more a mechanism of social sorting. Children from economically stable families remained at home, even if imperfectly cared for. Children from unstable economic backgrounds were reclassified and redistributed. Redistribution is a powerful word. In movements like the Orphan Trains, urban children were transported to rural communities under the banner of opportunity. Some placements were loving, others were exploitative. But the mechanism itself, removing children from dense immigrant neighborhoods and placing them in Protestant farming families, reveals another layer of social engineering. Culture, language, and class were reshaped alongside custody. Seen through this lens, the label orphan becomes a passport. It authorized movement across social boundaries. It permitted authorities to detach children from their origins and attach them to new environments deemed more suitable. And society accepted this because the moral narrative was clear: we are saving parentless children. But if those children had living parents, then the narrative concealed as much as it revealed. The metaphor of the map returns here with renewed clarity. At first, the terrain seemed fragmented, isolated institutions scattered across cities. Now we see them as nodes in a broader network, a network responding not only to death, but to industrial transformation. The revelation is not explosive, it is structural. Children were not labeled orphans because society was mistaken about their parents' survival. They were labeled orphans because the term simplified intervention. It made separation administratively clean and morally persuasive. Language built the bridge between poverty and removal, and once crossed, that bridge was difficult to retreat from. This hypothesis does not accuse every orphanage of malice. It does not deny genuine cases of bereavement. Instead, it suggests that the category itself expanded strategically, intentionally or not, to encompass children whose primary misfortune was economic vulnerability. As unsettling as this conclusion may sound, it resolves the anomalies with remarkable coherence. High percentages of living parents. Admissions tied to unemployment rather than mortality. Funding models encouraging expansion. Reformers later advocating family preservation. All align under one explanation: The orphanage system institutionalized poverty under the name of rescue. And when we understand that, the word orphan begins to feel less like a description of fate and more like a decision. A decision about how society chose to interpret hardship. At this point, a careful listener might pause and raise a necessary objection. Surely disease, war, and abandonment did create real orphans. Surely we are not suggesting that institutions fabricated suffering out of nothing. And we are not. Epidemics in the 19th century were devastating. Cholera outbreaks in the 1840s and 1850s swept through overcrowded urban neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Tuberculosis lingered for decades as a slow-moving killer. The American Civil War left hundreds of thousands dead, with widows and fatherless children struggling in its aftermath. Industrial accidents claimed fathers with alarming regularity. In Britain and the United States alike, mortality rates were undeniably higher than today. Genuine orphanhood existed. The question is not whether true orphans filled institutional beds. The question is proportion. When reform surveys and early 20th century child welfare reports consistently indicated that the majority of institutionalized children had at least one living parent, the narrative of mass bereavement becomes insufficient to explain scale. The numbers resist simplicity. Consider the work of early progressive reformers who examined the child welfare system from within. By the early 1900s, social investigators began conducting detailed case studies of orphanage residents. They discovered that many children could have remained with their mothers if modest financial assistance had been available. Widowed mothers with steady character and no record of abuse were often forced to surrender children purely because wages for women were too low to support a household. If a small pension could prevent separation, then death was not the primary driver. Economics was. Critics of institutionalization argued that the child welfare system had confused poverty with neglect. A parent unable to provide sufficient material comfort was categorized as incapable, even if emotionally devoted. The state intervened not because children were unloved, but because they were poor. Supporters of orphanages might respond that institutions provided stability where chaos reigned. And in some cases, they did. Many children received education they might otherwise have missed. Some formed lifelong friendships. Some placements through programs like the Orphan Trains led to supportive adoptive homes. History is rarely one-dimensional, but even these positive outcomes do not erase the structural pattern. When child welfare reformers began experimenting with mothers' pensions in the 1910s, they observed something revealing. As financial aid to families increased, institutional populations decreased. The correlation was direct. Where families were supported, fewer children entered orphanages. If orphanhood were primarily about parental death, pensions would not have altered admission rates so dramatically. Another counter-argument suggests that parents voluntarily surrendered children for their own benefit. Indeed, many did sign placement papers. But consent under economic desperation is complex. A mother choosing between starvation and institutional placement operates within constrained freedom. Moreover, institutional agreements often obscured the difficulty of reunification. What began as temporary shelter frequently became permanent removal. Records from certain orphanages reveal that once children were admitted, administrators sometimes discouraged parental retrieval unless families could demonstrate substantial improvement. Poverty became both the reason for entry and the barrier to exit. This circular logic strengthened the system's hold. We must also consider cultural patterns across regions. In both the United States and Britain, similar dynamics appeared. High rates of children with living parents in institutions, moral rhetoric linking poverty to character, and eventual reform movements advocating family preservation. These parallels suggest a broader industrial phenomenon rather than isolated mismanagement. It is unlikely that multiple societies independently miscounted parental deaths in identical ways. It is far more plausible that they shared structural pressures inherent to industrial modernity. Some historians caution against interpreting institutional growth as intentional social control. They emphasize genuine philanthropic motives. And it is essential to acknowledge that many reformers believed deeply in their mission. Yet intention does not nullify impact. A system can produce large-scale family separation without malicious design simply by aligning incentives in particular directions. Per capita funding rewards occupancy. Moral panic rewards intervention. Economic inequality produces vulnerability. Together, these elements create a feedback loop. When we examine the early 20th century shift toward foster care and family-based support, we see an implicit recognition of past overreach. The 1909 White House Conference declared that children should remain with their families whenever possible. Such a pronouncement would have been unnecessary if institutionalization had been strictly reserved for those without living parents. The reform itself is evidence. Even language evolved. Over time, the term orphanage gradually gave way to children's home or residential care facility. The shift reflects growing discomfort with the mismatch between terminology and reality. As child welfare policy matured, distinctions between orphanhood and dependency became more explicit. The elasticity of the word began to contract. This contraction supports the hypothesis that earlier elasticity had served a purpose. Once social policy acknowledged poverty directly, through pensions, labor reforms, and public assistance, the need to mask economic vulnerability under the label of orphan diminished. We are left, then, with a reinforced conclusion. The majority of children institutionalized during the peak orphanage era were not without parents. They were without economic security. The system responded to economic instability by reclassifying children into a morally compelling category. And when later reforms demonstrated that direct family support reduced institutionalization, the structural nature of the earlier approach became undeniable. The evidence does not rely on secret documents or hidden conspiracies. It rests on admission records, census data, funding models, and policy outcomes. It rests on the observable fact that when poverty was alleviated, the so-called orphan crisis subsided, which raises a final sobering reflection. If language can expand to absorb social problems without naming them, then we must remain vigilant about the categories we accept at face value. The orphanage era teaches us not only about child welfare history, but about the power of words to shape policy. Orphan did not always mean parentless. Sometimes it meant poor, and that distinction changes everything. If this reinterpretation holds, then the implications extend far beyond the walls of 19th century orphanages. We are no longer examining a historical footnote about child welfare. We are confronting a broader truth about how societies respond to instability and how easily language can transform economic hardship into moral narrative. What does it mean if the majority of so-called orphans were not abandoned by death, but displaced by poverty? It means that one of the most emotionally powerful symbols of innocence in modern history was quietly tethered to industrial inequality. It means that generations grew up believing they were witnessing a humanitarian response to tragedy, when in reality they were observing a structural response to economic volatility. This realization forces us to reconsider the moral architecture of the Industrial Revolution itself. We often describe that era as a time of innovation and growth, tempered by philanthropic reform. We celebrate the charitable institutions that arose to care for the vulnerable. But if those institutions expanded partly because society failed to protect families from economic shock, then charity begins to look like compensation for preventable harm. The orphanage in this light becomes both sanctuary and symptom. A sanctuary for individual children, perhaps, but a symptom of systemic fragility. When poverty is treated as a parental failing rather than a structural condition, intervention follows a predictable path. Remove the child, correct the environment, reform the character. The burden shifts away from factories, wages, and housing policies and lands squarely on the household. This pattern echoes across history. Social systems often individualize collective problems. Hunger becomes laziness. Illness becomes weakness. Poverty becomes moral deficiency. Once reframed in this way, the solution appears obvious: correction rather than reform. The orphan label performed precisely this reframing. It allowed society to respond to visible suffering without interrogating its roots. It provided moral clarity in an era of complexity. It reassured donors that they were addressing tragedy, not inequality. But the deeper implication is more personal. Imagine being a child within those walls, knowing that your mother still lived a few streets away, knowing that your father sought work after a factory closure, knowing that you were not alone in the world, yet officially recorded as such. Identity matters. Words shape how individuals understand themselves. To be called an orphan is to internalize a narrative of abandonment or loss. When that narrative diverges from lived reality, it creates dissonance. Some children may have embraced the institutional identity as survival. Others likely carried quiet confusion. The emotional history of these children remains partially hidden, preserved only in scattered letters and memoirs. Yet we can sense the tension. Belonging severed not by death, but by designation. The broader society, meanwhile, internalized its own narrative. The orphan became a figure of pure vulnerability, stripped of context, detached from systemic causes. Fundraising campaigns, literature, and public speeches reinforced this image. Over time, the complexity faded from collective memory. We inherited the simplified version, and this simplification has consequences. When history reduces institutionalized children to parentless victims of fate, it obscures the policy decisions that shaped their lives. It hides the fact that many separations were not inevitable, but contingent. Contingent on wage levels, contingent on housing shortages, contingent on the absence of social safety nets. Recognizing this does not diminish the compassion of those who worked within orphanages. It deepens our understanding of the environment in which they operated. Many caregivers were responding sincerely to what they perceived as abandonment. Yet their perception was shaped by the language and policy frameworks of their time. Language-guided action. The implications ripple forward. Modern child welfare systems continue to grapple with similar tensions. Even today, studies often show that poverty remains a significant factor in child removal cases. While definitions and protections have evolved dramatically, the underlying challenge persists: how to distinguish neglect from economic hardship, how to support families without stigmatizing them, how to intervene without overreaching. History does not repeat itself in identical form, but patterns echo. The orphanage era offers a cautionary lesson about categories. When a society creates a label that compresses diverse circumstances into a single moral narrative, it risks obscuring nuance. It risks prioritizing symbolic solutions over structural ones. And yet, there is also a quieter thread of hope woven into this story. The eventual rise of mothers' pensions, family preservation policies, and foster care reforms demonstrates that societies can learn. They can reassess assumptions. They can shift from institutionalization towards support. The elasticity of the word orphan eventually contracted because evidence accumulated. Reformers examined records. They calculated costs. They listened to parents. They recognized that children thrive best within families whenever possible. In that sense, the story is not solely about misclassification. It is about evolution. But evolution required acknowledging an uncomfortable truth, that the crisis was not simply one of parental death, but of economic design. And so we stand at a reflective vantage point. The red brick orphanages that once dominated city blocks have largely vanished or been repurposed. Their corridors no longer echo with regimented footsteps. Yet their legacy lingers in policy debates and cultural memory. The image of the orphan remains powerful. It evokes immediate empathy. It mobilizes action. But now we know that in the 19th century, that image often concealed living parents and fractured families. What does it mean for us if this is true? It means that compassion must be paired with inquiry. That before accepting a category at face value, we must ask who defines it and why. That social problems rarely fit neatly into a single word. The truth was never entirely hidden. It was recorded in ledgers, visible in census tables, whispered in reform reports, but it required willingness to question the narrative. And when we question it, a more complex picture emerges, not of villains and heroes, but of systems responding imperfectly to unprecedented change. The orphanage was not merely a building. It was a mirror reflecting how industrial society chose to interpret vulnerability. And in that reflection, we see both the limits of charity and the necessity of structural justice. We began with a question that seemed almost too stark to believe. How could it be that up to 90% of children in orphanages had living parents? Now, after tracing the threads of industrialization, funding structures, reform movements, and linguistic transformation, the answer no longer feels implausible. It feels inevitable. We discovered that orphanage history is not simply a chronicle of benevolent institutions rescuing children from death. It is a record of how societies manage instability, of how economic volatility, urban overcrowding, and moral anxiety converged to produce a system that classified children of poverty under a single, powerful word: orphan. The word carried weight. It stirred compassion. It opened wallets. It justified intervention, but it also simplified reality. It collapsed distinctions between bereavement and destitution. It allowed policymakers and philanthropists to respond to visible suffering without confronting the deeper architecture of inequality. And so, generation after generation, the image endured: rows of children without parents, saved by institutional care. The image was not entirely false. Genuine orphans did exist, but the proportions were never what popular memory suggests. When census reports and early 20th century investigations revealed that the majority of institutionalized children had at least one living parent, they exposed a quiet truth. The crisis was not primarily one of death. It was one of poverty. The orphanage system, at scale, functioned as a mechanism for redistributing children from economically unstable households into controlled environments. It responded to industrial capitalism's shocks by absorbing its most vulnerable consequences. This does not erase acts of kindness performed within those walls. It does not deny that some children found opportunity where none had existed before. History is rarely so simple, but complexity does not absolve us from asking difficult questions. If family separation occurred not because parents were gone, but because they were poor, then the moral frame shifts. We are no longer looking at an unavoidable tragedy. We are looking at policy shaped by priorities. And priorities reveal values. The values of the late 19th century placed extraordinary faith in institutional discipline and moral reform. They placed less emphasis on economic redistribution or labor protection. Supporting orphanages aligned with those values. Challenging wage structures did not. The result was a system that redefined vulnerability through language. Today, When we hear the word orphan, we imagine total isolation. We imagine a child entirely alone in the world. That image has been reinforced by literature, cinema, and collective memory. But the historical record complicates it. It reminds us that words can stretch to serve the needs of their time. The children who walked the corridors of those red brick buildings carried stories more intricate than a single label could capture. Some were truly bereaved. Others had mothers waiting in cramped tenements. Others had fathers searching for work after economic collapse. All were shaped by forces larger than themselves. As we reflect on this history, we are invited to reconsider how we interpret social categories today. When a label becomes dominant, when it simplifies complex realities into a single narrative, we must ask what it conceals. The lesson of the orphanage era is not merely historical, it is cautionary. Compassion is powerful, but compassion untethered from structural understanding can become a substitute for reform. It can soothe symptoms without addressing causes. It can create institutions that endure for decades before their premises are fully questioned. Yet history also shows the possibility of change. The rise of mothers' pensions, family preservation policies, and modern child welfare reforms demonstrates that societies can adjust course. They can recognize when a system overreaches. They can redefine their priorities. The orphanage system eventually receded, not because the need for compassion disappeared, but because understanding deepened. Policymakers began to see that supporting families directly preserved both dignity and stability more effectively than institutionalization. That evolution required confronting uncomfortable data. It required acknowledging that many so-called orphans were not parentless at all. And so we return to where we began. If 90% had living parents, then the word orphan was never purely literal. It was a bridge between economic hardship and institutional response. It was a narrative that made intervention morally clear while leaving structural inequality largely intact. Our investigation does not accuse, it illuminates. It invites us to see beyond the surface of historical memory and examine the systems beneath. History is rarely what it first appears to be. It is layered, shaped by incentives, language, and belief. When we peel back those layers, we often discover that the most powerful stories were built on simplifications. The orphanage stands as one such story. And as we close this chapter, one question lingers quietly in the background. What other categories in our own time might be performing similar work, simplifying complexity in ways we have yet to fully understand? The search for hidden patterns in history is far from over. If this journey has shifted the way you see orphanage history and the child welfare system, then continue exploring with us. There are more assumptions to question, more narratives to examine, more overlooked details waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe and remain part of this ongoing investigation, because sometimes the most familiar words carry the deepest mysteries.